Being an F1 driver has some parallels to the world of video games. Making it to F1, that's just completing the tutorial stage, and then waiting for you far off in the distance, the big main quest end of game final boss, being one of those select few to conquer the beast known as the World Championship. And as with any good game, there are concurrent side quests, objectives not mandatory for completion, but that if you've got the time to tick them off, well, that just might be jolly nice. Top of the checklist would likely be winning a specific pair of Grand Prix, an emotional win in front of your home crowd, and the prestige of winning on the streets of Monaco. And if we're considering etching yourself into history with your achievements, then what could be more respected, more reputable, than driving for the oldest, most famous team of them all? And if you can't get a drive for Sauber, you can always settle for Ferrari. Not all Italians support the national team, while all Italians and 50% of non-Italians support Ferrari. An accurate, if slightly biased, statement from former Fiat chairman Gianni Agnelli. Biases aside, it's undeniable that no other fan base can quite compare to that of Ferrari's tifosi, and their love for an institution that has been part of the furniture from the very beginning. Whilst others have come and gone from the front of the field, Ferrari has always endured. Perhaps it's the iconic nature of the sport's oldest outfit that has enticed so many of F1's greats who have raced for the prancing horse. Ascari, Fangio, Andretti, Lauda, Villeneuve, Prost, Mansell, Schumacher, Alonso, Vettel, Hamilton, and more, all iconic names who have been lured in by the passion and the charisma that emanates from Maranello. Those who have driven for Ferrari speak of it with utter reverence. Few things in this sport are irreplaceable, and they are one of them, says Gerhard Berger. His fellow alumni Rubens Barrichello concurs. To drive for Ferrari meant more to me than driving for any other team, simply because it was Ferrari. One can only imagine that such a desire would increase tenfold for an Italian driver. An Italian racing for Ferrari in recent times has been like bumping into a Lance Stroll fan in the street, an exceedingly rare situation. For a long time, such a fault could be laid at the feet of founder Enzo Ferrari, who was famously reluctant to hire Italian drivers following the blame he received at home after the deaths of the likes of Lorenzo Bandini and Eugenio Castellotti while driving his cars. But even following his death, that tradition has seemingly remained steadfast. In the past 36 years, just 5 Italians have had the honour of stepping into the cockpit of those regal red cars. None of the 5 have ever completed a full season. 2 of those, Gianni Morbidelli and Nicola Larini, cropped up as stand-in options in the early 90s, whilst Giancarlo Fisichella and Luca Badoa jumped behind the wheel in the latter half of 2009. Fisichella's traipse to 16th place at the 2009 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix remains the last time an Italian raced for Ferrari. We have, of course, omitted one name from that paragraph for the sake of building tension in a video where his name is clearly visible in the title: Ivan Capelli. He is the only one of this quintet to have at least started the season with Ferrari. In another universe, his Ferrari foray could have been akin to a video game protagonist, a feel-good rags-to-riches tale of the boy from Milan, who once sat in Niki Lauda's car at 12 years old, who grew up and after paying their dues with underdog performances in the midfield, was rewarded with that return home to that most Italian of institutions and finally conquering the world. Unfortunately for Ivan, that tale must have been coded out from a different version of the game. Instead of stepping into an iconic Ferrari like the dominant F2004, the rapid 312T, or the strikingly gorgeous 156 Sharknose, Capelli drove what is widely considered one of the worst Ferraris ever from a long list of models to choose from. Ivan is far from unique in being a copy-pasted story of a talented driver being given, bluntly, a total box. The key difference is that whereas so many other stories of that ilk would lead to better times or perhaps a second bite of the cherry elsewhere, Ivan was afforded no such luxury. Instead of kick-starting his F1 career into overdrive, it effectively ended it. Unlike those prior heartwarming sentiments that those ex-Ferrari drivers have spoken of their experiences there, finding a similar statement from Ivan Capelli is a much trickier process. At his politest, he recalls his time there as not a nice experience at all. With social niceties removed from his consideration, he has quipped that the whole thing was a nightmare from about day 2. Ivan had rampaged through the junior formulas, winning the Italian Formula 3, European Formula 3 and F1 secondary division of Formula 3000 within a 4-year span. In stark contrast to the modern era where junior success is so often recognised by blank stares and furtive glances elsewhere, the higher-ups in F1 recognised his capabilities, and following a pair of brief cameo appearances with Tyrrell and AGS, Capelli began his F1 career in earnest in 1987 with a Leighton House March outfit. The following year, with a promising young car designer by the name of Adrian Newey now on the books, the combination of Capelli and his March 881 proved an enormous success. Ivan Septen decoupled his points tally of 1987 to rank 7th overall, with highlights including a 3rd place finish in Belgium, battling with and beating Ayrton Senna's McLaren to 2nd in Portugal, and being the only non-turbo car to lead a lap throughout the entire season. By year's end, his name was being mentioned within the same capacity as the likes of Senna, Prost and Mansell. Words like mercurial, star and brilliant talent were attached to his name in Murray Walker's season review of the year. Plagued with unreliability in 1989, Capelli roared back into the public's consciousness in 1990 when he so nearly pulled off one of the greatest upsets of all time at the French Grand Prix, where, having failed to qualify for the previous race in Mexico and having not scored a point for nearly 18 months, he led for 45 laps at Paul Ricard, only denied an outrageous underdog win when his oil pump detached with 3 laps to go, but still dragging the car home in 2nd place. Later that year, Benetton's Alessandro Nannini severed his right forearm in a freak helicopter accident, and Capelli found one Flavio Briatore ringing up to inquire about his availability as a replacement. Admirably, Ivan had already verbally agreed to renew his contract with the Leighton House team owner Akira Akagi, and sticking to his principles, turned Briatore down. Nannini's replacement Roberto Moreno would promptly finish 2nd on his Benetton debut and was swiftly handed a contract with the outfit for 1991, which proved to be considerably more competitive than Leighton House. Financial troubles were beginning to take hold at the Cyan Society, and the team's budget was being hastily slashed by the day. Soon, key staff began to jump ship, Newey to Williams, team manager Ian Phillips to Jordan, with several other engineers departing too. The result was a hasty downturn in performances, with a solitary point from Ivan in Hungary being a rare high point. Akagi was arrested after being implicated in a financial scandal in September, and the team's money promptly went from quite short to Yuki Tsunoda short. Showcasing his class morals once more, Capelli stepped aside for the final 2 races to make way for well-sponsored Mercedes junior Karl Wendlinger. "I didn't receive my salary that year," he says, "but paid my own way to the final races in Japan and Australia just to support the team." Regardless of his good guy status and the blips of promise he'd showcased, Capelli declared his 5 full years in the sport at this point as frustrating because I've not had the opportunity to show how good I am or how good I think I am. It was the same story as told by so many other young guns over the years, a lack of competitive machinery to truly showcase what a driver could do. "I've always had a car which was up and down in performance, never consistent," said Ivan. "For winning races and fighting for the championship, you need a consistent car. We tried to improve at Leighton House, but we were always missing something, the wrong engine or the wrong aerodynamics." It didn't appear that there were many opportunities on the market for Ivan to finally secure that competitive chance he was craving. Benetton had come knocking once more, offering the Italian a pre-contract for 1992 in Belgium. which had swiftly been recirculated to a shredder when a certain Michael Schumacher turned heads upon his Grand Prix debut. The German would go on to finish third in the 1992 championship at the wheel of the nimble Benetton B192, and would be world champion just 2 years after that. Instead of moving up the order, it seemed as if Capelli would instead be making the sideways step to BMS Scuderia Italia for the following year, who, despite picking up a shiny new Ferrari customer engine deal, seemed consigned to a steady circulation within the lower midfield. That could have been it for Ivan, yet another tale from the F1 annals of a talented young prospect who just never got the breaks he deserved. And so it might have been, until a late vacancy cropped up at the superior Scuderia in town. The Ferrari fables of Alain Prost are enough of a saga that warrants a standalone video, but rather than inserting a second in-depth Ferrari-based analysis into this essay and making the whole thing longer and more tedious than an Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, as the great Inigo Montoya once said, "Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up." Following the less-than-civil McLaren civil war between himself and Senna, F1's then most successful driver had moved to Ferrari for 1990 and was tasked with the goal of bringing the world title back to Maranello for the first time in over a decade. And with 5 wins, the Frenchman came mighty close to doing so, finishing runner-up after a second controversial collision with Senna at Suzuka. But the following year was drastically less successful, and for the first time in 10 years, Prost found himself in a position where he was unable to win races, let alone a world championship. Both the Ferrari 642 and 643 models used that year were riddled with inconsistent handling, frightful unreliability, and an increasingly uncompetitive V12 engine. It didn't take long for tensions to begin to fray. Prost made no secret of his displeasure with the car to both the team and the media, and the resentful Italian press would then regularly respond with their own cavalcade of criticisms over Alain, and repeatedly called for his dismissal. It was a question of when, not if, the two parties would be taking the next train to Splitsville. By the penultimate round in Japan, rumours were rife that the breakup was already in motion, with a furious Prost claiming several Ferrari members had asked him not to bother coming to Suzuka, and it took every ounce of team manager Claudio Lombardi's being to convince his driver just to stay and drive. With this saga rumbling in the background, sources reported that the now sidelined Capelli was ready and available to step into that Ferrari seat at a moment's notice. As it happens, Alain did stay for the weekend, but it didn't take long for the bad blood to be spilled once more. After lumbering to a 4th place finish on Sunday, 80 seconds down the road from race winner Berger, Prost was quoted as declaring, "It was like a horrible truck to drive, no pleasure at all." It was a quote that would prove to be the straw that broke the camel's back. On the eve of the season finale in Australia, Ferrari sacked Prost. Test driver Gianni Morbidelli took over for the final round, but it was clearly just a temporary measure. The question on everyone's lips was who would enter the Ferrari fracas now? Given that this split soup had been bubbling on the stove for some time now, there was no shortage of tabloid rumours as to who might succeed the professor. Some whispered it would be a big-name signing as befitting of the sport's biggest brand. A pair of Andrettis and Mario and son Michael were spotted touring the Maranello facilities. Nigel Mansell was supposedly visited by a team emissary at his private retreat in Portugal, and Nelson Piquet was spotted chatting with Lombardi at the Spanish Grand Prix. And then there were whispers of those with less headlining names, but of a considerably more Italian persuasion. Stefano Medina, Pierluigi Martini, and yes, Ivan Capelli, all of whom held conversations with Ferrari vice-chairman Piero Landi Ferrari within the paddock at Portugal. It soon emerged that Ivan's contract with Scuderia Italia was actually made between the Italian and Ferrari, Scuderia Italia's new engine suppliers, meaning Ivan was perfectly poised as a backup option for Ferrari should matters with Prost come to a conclusion. Not long after the season ended, Lombardi phoned Capelli to offer him every Italian's dream drive. By the end of November, Ivan was signed as a Ferrari driver on a 4-year deal. He later recalled, That morning, I drove to Maranello. I stopped just before the highway to refuel and it was no problem. 8 hours later in the evening, we stopped again to refuel at the same place, and in 5 seconds my car was surrounded by people asking for autographs. To match that tifosi fever, it seems fitting we should start with one of our frequent trips to the Positive pub for a cheeky round of half-full glasses of optimism. With Ferrari still seeking a way out of their decade-long doldrums and even just a winless 1991, it was an unsurprising sight to see a major reshuffling of personnel for the umpteenth time in that period. The key difference here was that this rebuild had all the hallmarks of being the one that would finally get things right. Ask a passing Italian why this time would be the right time, and they'd have retorted that well-known phrase, "Dude, we're getting the band back together." A trio of Ferrari's finest were about to be reinstalled at Maranello, all with ample experience of bringing success to the Italian outfit. Luca de Montezemolo, who had previously managed and reinvigorated the Scuderia in the mid-70s, was reinstalled as Ferrari president by Fiat chairman Agnelli. Il Presidente promptly held the door open for the man who had delivered Ferrari 2 drivers and 2 constructors titles in that time, a certain Niki Lauda, who was brought in within an advisory capacity. He was soon joined by Harvey Postlethwaite, whose Ferrari designs had secured a further 2 Constructors' Championships in the early 80s and had remained a relevant presence within the paddock, with his work at Tyrrell across the previous 4 years having allowed the former champions to soar back through the pecking order. No one believed that their return would reinvigorate Ferrari to title contenders overnight. Indeed, it was rivals Williams and McLaren who looked primed for a duel over that honour in 1992, but both Ferrari and Benetton were safely ensconced in 3rd and 4th, comfortably clear over what was a relatively uncompetitive midfield bunch. So consistent points on the odd podium was a more than achievable goal for all parties, as the outfit regrouped, rebuilt and established foundations to narrow that gap to the front for 1993. A quiet year was what Capelli and co needed, and it was precisely what they wouldn't get. Such a mentality might have been fine at any of those other members of the Big Four, but at Ferrari? With the expectation of an entire nation upon them? No such luxury. And that weight of expectation would be amongst the least of Ferrari's many, many problems. No sooner have we chugged our positive pints than it's time to head back to the bar for some sobering shots of realism. For all the positivity over reintroducing De Montezemolo, Lauda and Postlethwaite back after a decade or 2 away, one only has to look at the modern day example of an outfit like Alpine reunited with Briatore, a man who had also brought them ample success 20 years previously and a glaring lack of similar results upon his return, to know that looking backward is rarely the way to be moving forwards for a team with any mild form of ambition. F1 was a rapidly evolving beast in the early 90s, with driver preparation and technology moving forward at a vast rate of knots, marking a chasm between then and the plug-in-and-play era of the 70s. Not only were the old guard's modern capabilities under the spotlight, but so too were the new guard pairing of Capelli and new teammate Jean Alesi. Both had demonstrated flashes of talent up to this point, but were glaringly without a win between the two of them, making them Ferrari's first winless lineup since 1968. If established names like Mansell or Prost had been unable to revive Ferrari's fortunes in recent years, what chance did these guys have of stepping up as a team leader, bringing a title back to Maranello? Ivan's first experience with Ferrari was with the old 91 car, an experience which he remembers with clear reverie as one might anticipate from an Italian driving in a Ferrari F1 car. When I left the pits with the little black horse in the middle of my steering wheel, I couldn't believe it. On your skin you have a feeling that is fantastic. You can't really find the words to describe it. In what was a significant upgrade from his Leighton house that year, Capelli went and broke the lap record at Barcelona over winter testing. But all positivity promptly evaporated when he stepped foot into the car he'd actually be driving that year. You can immediately feel after one lap whether a car is good or not, says Ivan, and I could tell straight away it didn't feel right. Much like those memorable machines of Ferrari's past that we attested to earlier, The Ferrari of 1992, the F92A, lives in infamy for most of the tifosi, but for all of the wrong reasons. For all of Postlethwaite's pedigree, there was very little he could do with Ferrari's new offering, given it was already ready and waiting by the time he opened the door to his design office. With predecessors John Barnard and Steve Nichols having long since departed, the resulting car had effectively been designed by a committee. As the old saying goes, too many cooks will spoil the broth. Though it featured a novel twin-floor concept concocted by aerodynamicist Jean-Claude Migeot with the intent of increasing downforce, history will attest this Ferrari model was not particularly good, to put it lightly. And intriguingly, no one involved with it can fully agree why. If you were to read reports from the time, they would tell you that the issues laid within a tricky, finicky chassis. The start of the year is listed with comments over the car's disastrous handling and mismatched balance, understeering on a full tank of fuel, then oversteering when the tank ran low. Capelli has described how that twin-floor concept simply didn't work, stating its weight caused extra roll which upset its dynamics. Other issues stemmed from a mismatched suspension scheme, with a brand new monoshock system at the front being joined by a 4-year-old version at the back, creating a Frankenstein hybrid of a car. There were more mechanical maladies to be found with the gearbox. The car had been designed with a transverse version, but bafflingly Ferrari had only been able to make 2 that worked properly, and gave both to Alain. For the first half of the year, Ivan instead wound up using a longitudinal gearbox from the 91 car. With 2 completely different cars in their garage, there was no way for the teammates to exchange information or troubleshoot any of their issues. The only bright spot in Capelli's eyes was the engine, but even that had been ruined by the issues in the rest of the car. The bodywork around it was so tight, Ivan recalls, it couldn't get rid of that heat build-up in a race, which cost us power and reliability. Ask Migeot or Alain, and they'll insist the car itself was a tidy enough package on the aerodynamic front, and are happy to gesticulate only at the Ferrari V12 as their main source of problems. The engine suffered from blow-by, says Alain. There was oil leaking from the piston rings into the combustion chamber that caused a loss of 40 to 50 horsepower. Capelli has confirmed that at the beginning of the year, the engines were revving up to 13,500 RPM, which was pared back to just 11,800 in an attempt to wrangle some reliability out of it. Ask why there is no consensus on this matter and Jean will tell you, in the tradition of the prancing horse, you couldn't say it was the engine that wasn't working. The blame for a bad year was attributed only to the car. Ferrari absolving any blame is certainly a topic that we'll circle back around to. The one matter everyone can agree on was that things weren't looking good. More weight was added to that argument when testing of the new car didn't begin until just 2 weeks before setting out for the first round in South Africa. A lot of this criticism has come from more recent interviews with the likes of Capelli, Alain and Migeot, but even at the time, Ivan had isolated plenty of issues with the car after his first run. Whilst he didn't go so far as to proclaiming the car as sugar honey iced tea, he didn't waste time in pointing out a need to refine the front suspension and the aero. But as we've already seen from the falling out between Prost and the team just a few months previously, Ferrari were not in a space whereupon criticism was taken lightly. Worse yet, his sentiments were not being echoed across the garage, with Alain declaring it healthy, well-balanced, the best car he'd ever drove, and one he felt could win races and challenge for the championship. Whether genuinely believed or not, it rallied the Ferrari troops to Jean's side. I pointed out that we were 1.5 seconds slower than Williams, said Capelli, but they just said I didn't understand, and chose to believe Jean. So, to quickly summarise, a problematic car with just about everything wrong with it as you could crowbar in, a newly installed and debatably out of touch management, and a team seemingly fully behind one driver and more than content to shun their new one before he'd even started a race for them. Still, it couldn't get much worse, right? Capelli began his tenure with what seemed a creditable 9th on the grid, but came with the footnotes of being over a second shy of Alain and almost 3 seconds adrift of pole sitter Mansell. Race day was just about as whelming as he trailed Berger in the battle for the last point for 34 laps before the day came to an early close with an overheating engine as the new Ferrari V12 engine slurped through its oil consumption quicker than an Englishman necks their 17th cuppa of the day. entirely unable to handle the high G-forces of the South African circuit. It speaks volumes that despite that middling debut, Capelli described his Ferrari as having never worked so well. Engine exploration was the buzzword in Mexico too, with the motors routinely failing every 4 laps throughout practice. On the rare occasion they were lasting long enough to set lap times, power levels were frankly non-existent, with Alesi the second slowest of all in the speed trap. Both Ferraris were outqualified by the customer Ferrari outfit BMS Scuderia Italia, where Capelli could have been driving, let's not forget, despite chief engine designer Paolo Masai insisting the works team should have a 20 horsepower advantage. Alesi was a disappointed 10th, but Ivan was a humiliating 20th, the worst qualifying by a Ferrari since 1980, and one that wouldn't be matched until the Ferrari fiascos of one Luca Badoa some 17 years later. Mercifully, he was put out of his misery within metres of the start, when Wendlinger's march tagged him, sending the Italian into the wall. With Alesi having failed to finish either of the first 2 races as well and 0 points on the board, Ferrari were enduring their worst start to a season since 1986, and even Jean had bid a hasty backpedal on his initial pre-season praise to state their F92A was simply undrivable. After some hastily scheduled testing at Fiat's Nardo test circuit in an attempt to isolate the issues with both the chassis and the V12, Ferrari elected to plug the previous year's engines into the back of the car for the next round in Brazil in an attempt to solve their reliability woes, the result of which was the rare sighting of both Ferraris circulating at the end of the race, with Alesi 4th and Capelli 5th. But few felt this was the end of the Scuderia's or Ivan's early sorrows. For Capelli's first Ferrari points were a lot less impressive when you consider the Italian had qualified a lowly 11th, and his eventual 5th place was more due to several cars who had started in front of him having retired, rather than unlocking any sort of pace from the car. That was backed up by the sight of being 30 seconds down the road from Alesi, or the sight of Capelli being hounded by the veteran Michele Alboreto in his footwork for most of the closing stages. Seemingly as mismanaged as a modern-day Red Bull outfit, it perhaps won't come as a shock to hear that the topic of driver swaps was being mooted as early in the season as this. Stood about the Ferrari garages for most of the weekend was the recently retired Nelson Piquet, and though the official line was that he was just there to see old pals Lauda and Alesi, there was no shortage of whispers suggesting that he had been contacted by Ferrari to replace Capelli. Though they proved wide of the mark, the ongoing debate of who could or who would supplant Capelli, potentially sooner rather than later, would dog him nearly every weekend. The measure of any driver is often valued by how they respond to such pressures, and if we are to judge Capelli's counter on the basis of qualifying for the Spanish Grand Prix, you could only say it was the perfect retort when he qualified a fine 5th with his closest gap to the front yet and out-qualifying Alesi for the first time. What followed was an exceptional wet weather drive that the passionate tifosi would compare to that of Ferrari legend Gilles Villeneuve. From the other Ferrari. For Capelli, Spain would spark the start of a run that would provide a sobering answer to the question posed from his first Ferrari outings: surely things can't get any worse. Whilst his teammate was taking Ferrari's first rostrum of the year, Capelli was circulating down in 6th. With 3 laps to go, the rear end of Senna snapped away and now another 5th place was on the cards, only for Ivan to promptly spin off the road as well. If the Scuderia had been subtly consigning Capelli to number 2 status behind their prodigal son Alesi before this point, it was no longer hidden to the public by San Marino, with Jean now granted exclusive dibs on the spare car from this point onward. To further rub salt into the wound, Ferrari had developed 2 new floors for the first Italian race of the year, one of which would be on Alesi's car, and the other on the spare. With that in mind, it was a cracking effort from Ivan to be within 2/10 of his teammate in qualifying, but whilst Alesi was able to mix it with the likes of the second-best McLarens and Benettons on race day, Capelli found himself tumbling further behind the other Ferrari, partly due to brake bias imbalance, and as he attempted to adjust it heading into the Acqua Minerale chicane on lap 12, the Italian locked up and slid off. At Monaco, de Montezemolo was out and about to claim that Capelli's position within the team was perfectly safe. It was not a statement that many believed in, especially when the Ferrari president was later seen speaking warmly with Alesi and conspicuously neglecting Capelli. The rumour mill of replacements had started up again too, The legal proceedings between Prost and Ferrari had finally reached a compromise, with Alain pocketing a cool 10 million francs in compensation in exchange for dropping his proceedings against the Scuderia. The calming of those uneasy waters was all the Italian press needed to convince themselves that this meant De Montezemolo was now attempting to entice Prost to return to the fold, whilst Lauda was supposedly championing his compatriot Wendlinger for a mid-season swap from March. With such mounting pressures, a welcome return to the points would have been the minimum target to alleviate any worries. Thanks in part to numerous retirements in front again, Ivan was running back in the top 5 once more. But with a handful of laps to go, he spun at Casino Square, damaging his steering arm. In his attempt to return to the pits for repairs, he span again, this time at Rascasse, rode backwards up the Armco and found he and his Ferrari wedged at a precarious 45-degree angle. The result was humiliation on the racetrack and further humiliation in the presses, with the Italian media labelling poor Ivan anemic with a distinct lack of red in his blood, a metaphor to state he was not worthy of his Ferrari seat, with no passion for the prancing horse in his body. Yet another name was added to the growing list of rumoured replacements for Capelli in Canada, with reigning kart champion Michael Andretti spotting touring about the pits in twain with Father Mario, himself a former Ferrari alumni. A continued lack of speed emanating from the Ferrari left him only 9th on the grid, and when throttle troubles struck the next day, he could only watch the leading pack scamper down the road before he violently struck the wall on lap 19 so hard that he actually banged his head against the concrete. Whilst it might have seemed like another Ivan-induced retirement, the 5th such incident from the opening 7 races, the truth was far more disturbing. The crash had not been caused by driver error but a front wishbone failure. With Ferrari facing increasing scrutiny for their rotten start to the year, the team begged Ivan to claim the retirement was in fact due to an error on his part in an attempt to save face. And for the team player, Ivan dutifully played the scapegoat. A reluctance from Ferrari to accept their own shortcomings continued in France. Capelli bowed out with an engine failure on lap 39, which team manager Sante Gadini promptly denied, stating the retirement was caused by an electronics issue, pig-headedly ignoring the plume of blue smoke from the rear of the car. For all the good Ivan's sacrifices were making, by Silverstone, Ferrari candidate number 5 was now strolling through the rumour mill, with journalists cranking out reports that Senna had met with De Montezemolo, had toured the Ferrari factory, and even negotiated a 2-year $25 million contract with Lauda. Though the reports proved wide of the mark, it was becoming increasingly obvious that figuring out who would be sat in the second Ferrari next year was as easy as A, B, C. Anyone but Capelli. Once again, the off-track shenanigans would prove considerably more exciting than the afternoon's events for Ivan, who saw the checkered flag for only the 2nd time that year but in an anonymous 9th place, unable to pass the lower midfield pairing of Alboreto and Eric Comas. If matters were to improve, they certainly wouldn't at Hockenheim, which would be another prime weekend for Capelli condemnation. After finishing 16th in first practice, a moody Lauda had rounded on Ivan in the pits, unleashing the cutting remark, "If you've been driving like that for 12 years, you've been wrong from the beginning." Worse still, the Alesi favouritism remained in full swing, with only the Frenchman privy to a new front suspension upgrade. And just to pop a cherry on top of this salty Sunday, De Montezemolo would inform Ivan the news that most had whispered about all year: he'd need to look for another drive in 1993. Back in the shop window, any hopes of showing off his skills to potential suitors were nipped in the bud by the breathless Ferrari engines meeting their kryptonite of long straights on the German circuit, and Capelli was nearly 5 seconds adrift of pole, would go on to suffer an engine failure after just 21 laps the next day. Ivan arrived in Hungary for what would be Ferrari's 500th Grand Prix battered and bruised, not just from his encounters with the Ferrari management, but from a huge testing crash at Imola in between races. It was therefore a welcome sight to see him not only finish the race, but to do so in the points for only the 2nd time. His reward was getting to watch as Alesi received the keys to the new Ferrari F92 AT in time for Belgium, and watch his teammates start 5th and run as high as 2nd before retiring. Capelli, meanwhile, was 5.5 seconds from pole, and behind even the lowly fond metal of Gabriele Tarquini. To his credit, he entered the points by lap 4, and it was only yet another engine failure that denied him a 2nd consecutive points finish. For his home outing, Ivan was finally blessed with access to the improved F92 AT and promptly enjoyed his best qualifying since Spain, winding up a respectable 7th. Just as it seemed his luck was about to change, matters came to a head, perhaps fittingly, on lap 13 of the race. Alesi conked out at Lesmo with a mechanical failure, and mere seconds after that, Capelli would slide off the circuit at the Parabolica, both whilst inside the points. It would have been a year with more low points than a Nikita Mazepin career highlight reel. Portugal provided one of his most woeful performances. It was only a last-gasp qualifying effort that lifted him from 21st to the dizzying heights of 16th on the grid, and he spent most of the race circulating at the lower end of matters before an engine failure took him out of his misery, stretching his retirement rate into double digits for the year. The next day he was summoned to Maranello and was promptly informed by Postlethwaite and Gadini that he wouldn't be participating in the final 2 races of the year. It was clear matters with Ivan weren't going to improve, and Ferrari were facing the galling prospect of being vaulted by a resurgent Lotus in the standings, who were just 3 points shy following a run of 5-point scoring finishes in the last 7 races by sophomore Mika Häkkinen. Equally, the team had earmarked these last races to trial their new active suspension system ahead of 93, and longtime tester Larini, who had assisted its progress behind the scenes, was a logical pick to continue that development. It would have been little comfort for Ivan to see his compatriot struggle also, with any performative gain from this new technology comfortably counterbalanced by the 30 kilograms extra it added to the car, and Larini's 2 cameo appearances would only net a pair of lowly placings well adrift of the points. Ferrari barely clung on to 4th place, finishing just 8 points ahead of Lotus, and an enormous 70 behind the bronze-medalled Benettons. However pitiful it had been for Ferrari, it was perhaps only tenfold for poor Ivan. Few would argue that Luca Badoer is amongst the least successful to have placed their Quistis upon a Ferrari-branded F1 seat, but in terms of those who have tackled a full-time campaign, or at least tried to, it would be hard to find anyone with a worse record than Ivan Capelli. Across those 14 races, he produced a measly 3 points, comfortably dwarfed by a then record points tally of 108 by Mansell. Whilst the difference in competitiveness between the Williams and Ferrari that year could not have been more night and day, even teammate Alesi was able to conjure forth 18 points of his own, alongside 2 podiums. The Frenchman decimated his new teammate on just about every day of a race weekend. On Saturdays, the qualifying head-to-head read 13-1, with an average gap of 0.8 between the two. And on Sundays, factoring in Ferrari's floundering reliability and judging on who was ahead when one or both cars parked up at the side of the road, it was a crushing 14-0 whitewash. A depressed Ivan reflected some years later. I realised I had lost my chance. For my career, it was the top and the start of the end. His reputation was the equivalent of Rubeus Hagrid approaching a door given the huge knock it had now received. There were those who felt he had the potential to rekindle some of that old magic, namely his old Leighton House team manager Ian Phillips, who was now the commercial director at Jordan. We felt he would be more at home with Jordan than Ferrari, wrote Eddie Jordan. Unbeknown to us, the damage done during those 12 months at Maranello was irreparable. A careless crash at his first race was preceded by failing to qualify for his second, and when Ivan refused to pay the $1 million owed for the seat, citing, "After 93 Grand Prix I didn't think I should be bringing money," Jordan and Capelli parted ways. In my view, he never recovered mentally from the hammering he received at Ferrari, said Jordan. Ivan would reach out to another old pal from the Leighton House days, Adrian Newey, to inquire whether there was any space for a testing role at Williams for 1994. With the shake-ups to come at Grove that year and with Ivan's wealth of F1 experience, he could well have been the logical choice to step up over the baby-faced David Coulthard and enjoyed a welcome final hurrah in the spotlight. Alas, there was no room at the inn, and that's when I realised the door back into F1 was closed, reflected Capelli. From comparisons with some of the sport's greats just 5 years earlier, Ivan Capelli's story was over just 16 months from signing that fateful Ferrari form at the tender age of 29. Perhaps the kindest thing we can do for poor Ivan is to reflect on what could have been. What if somehow this had all miraculously worked? Where roles were reversed and it was Capelli extracting Villeneuve-esque performances from his machinery. Within the next 2 years, Ferrari were race winners again. By 1996, Schumacher joined and their rise back to the top would begin in earnest. Ivan would have still been in his early 30s at the time, now armed with perhaps a win or two from the past few years on his resume. In many ways, he could tick all the boxes for a prospective number 2 to Schumacher. It's often been rumoured that Ferrari wanted to place their long-standing test driver Larini alongside Schumacher for 96, but that Michael vetoed it, concerned an Italian within Ferrari would divert attention from his undisputed number 1 status. But would an older, more successful driver have been a non-negotiable from the team's perspective? With the likes of old stablemate Alesi continuing on in F1 until 2001 at the age of 37, there's a world where Capelli can be found celebrating with Todd, Brawn, Schumacher and co. on breaking Ferrari's title drought before bowing out from the sport around the same time. But instead it was, as Capelli put it, a nightmare from about day 2. A recollection that stands at polar opposite from the reverie of so many Ferrari alumni. A perfectly logical parallel, you might think. It's only natural that those who pranced that horse to the top of the podium would remember their times at Maranello fondly, and those who struggled would only have negatives to contribute. So let's consider one Luca Badoa, who qualified and finished last in both of his brief cameos, and was subject to no end of torrent of abuse from fans and the media alike, who revelled in bestowing him the moniker, "Look how bad you are." You ask Luca what it was like, and he has said, to drive a Ferrari in a race is something special. So what made Ivan Capelli's Ferrari foray the far from fondly remembered fiasco it was then? The most obvious point of concern would be the foul and fetid F92A. We have discussed at length its myriad of shortcomings. Suffice to say, in the plainest of English, bad car mean driver no go fast. Inconsistent, unbalanced, powered by an unreliable and latterly underpowered engine. Who could drag any level of performance out of that? Well, Jean Alesi could, and did. But it would be just plain unfair to directly compare the two, given how mismatched the Ferrari garage was that year. If not from day one, then seemingly week one, all impetus was thrust behind Alesi's side of the garage, and the ongoing differences and updates and support between the two Ferraris are testament to that. Yes, there was a gulf between the two men's performances, because of course there would be if one has significantly better backing and machinery than the other. On top of that, there's a suggestion from Capelli that the car just suited Alesi better. It's a statement taken straight out of page 1 of the bumper book of driver excuses, but it's still worth a consideration. Jean was more brutal with the steering wheel when he turned in, according to Ivan. My driving style was a little bit cleaner. When I started pushing, the car went nowhere. Such a testament could go some way to explain some of the spins and crashes Capelli produced throughout the year, as he tried to find the limit in the car and inevitably overstepped. There is, of course, another explanation, one simpler if harsher. Within a rhetoric of reflection upon a driver, there is always a writer's inclination to root for them and make them the hero of the story. But to be objective, we have to consider the worldview that Capelli simply wasn't as good as many thought. Given his career prior to 92, the guy was clearly no slouch. There is an argument to be made that, armed with an early new car, his performances merely flattered to deceive. There is a proverb about a certain class of drivers who were clearly exceptional midfield operators, but never showcased that same level of talent when they upgraded their machinery to a top-of-the-line package. Consider the likes of a Sergio Perez or a Giancarlo Fisichella. Concerning Ivan's countryman, there is an old adage from Matt Bishop who stated, if his car is good enough for P9, he'll almost always give you P9, but if it's good enough for P1, he'll often give you P3. Sometimes drivers reach a comfort level within the midfield zone, and after an extended period of time there, it's hard to then adapt to another level. Refreshingly, Capelli is amongst those to latterly admit he wasn't the full package when it came to F1. I can realise today, watching F1 from another point of view, that I had a lack of concentration. Being in the paddock after 4 or 5 o'clock, where other people are working and thinking, my brain was already elsewhere. This was probably the biggest weak point for me. He has also admitted that spending so long at the English-speaking March outfit hindered his progress, as he found it tricky to communicate technical feedback in his mother tongue to his Italian mechanics. Perhaps, though, Ivan could have unlocked that potential he had there had he been part of an environment more akin to a family atmosphere, something that was distinctly denied to him at Ferrari. The earliest example can be found before his F1 days even began, back in Formula 3000, when his Genoa outfit, comprised of a whopping 4 members, took on and beat the big factory boys of March, Ralt and Lola. That same feeling was replicated at March, which, granted along with the stylings of Nui, was part of the reason he could shine there. We worked as a family, says Ivan. My teammate Mauricio and I used to eat together, go on holiday together. With Ferrari, a driver relationship like that was impossible. Indeed, rather than the lovable little brother at the gathering, Ivan instead took on the role of the ignored and overlooked middle child. As the new guy, I had no voice in the middle of the chaos. I wasn't part of it. Rather than displaying any love or affection, it seems Ferrari never truly wanted Capelli there. Maybe that was a fallout from his early criticisms of the car. The result was constant rumours of replacement from just 2 races in, either in 92 or for 93, and the fact that said replacement would yo-yo from realistic prospects like a Senna or a Piquet to the perplexing idea of welcoming Prost back into the fold, all the way to frankly outlandish candidates like a Wendlinger or Andretti, reinforces a sense that Ivan was always in a holding pattern, whilst the latest management upheaval settled in and began to re-sculpt the team once more. That can be reinforced by the fact that Capelli joined Ferrari a month before Di Montezemolo returned, and in Ivan's own words, I was not his choice, he just found me there. He could never settle, never succeed, in an outfit that seemingly had no intent on ever letting him do either. Maybe even with a better car and a better environment, Capelli's talents had reached a ceiling that he could not extend beyond. But maybe we could have seen someone unlock their potential, rather than yet another example of those who proved marvellous in the midfield, but faltering at the front.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pitbox of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pitwall that it's the best strategy available for you.